In the world of high-stakes science, we are taught to follow the data wherever it leads. We view the scientific method as an impenetrable fortress of objective truth. But what happens when the data itself is a digital mirage? Welcome to the Artifact Podcast, where we peel back the pristine, perfect layers of modern discovery to find the human errors, the seductive dogmas, the juicy academic gossip, and the billion-dollar ghosts hidden inside the machine. I'm your host, Daniel Walls. Today, we begin our investigation into a theory so powerful, so perfectly constructed, it successfully silenced an entire field for 16 years. A story of forged pixels, cutthroat academic politics, and a search for a cure that cost the world an estimated $42.5 billion. This is the Toxic Star. Before we get into the heavy stuff, let's talk about how the sausage of scientific publishing is actually made. If you want your research to be accepted as gospel, you publish in Nature or Science. Most people don't know that the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, was created all the way back on 1848 in Philadelphia. Their goal was to be the first permanent national organization to promote science. But the actual science magazine, that didn't arrive until 1880. But the origins of science hold a juicy secret about how science and money have always been in bed together. The journal was founded in 1880 by a New York journalist named John Michaels, but the real muscle was Thomas Edison. At the time, Edison was facing severe delays with his light bulb, and his reputation was sinking. So, he funded science, and in return, he received incredibly favorable editorial treatment to prop up his public image, without ever disclosing the cash flow. It was a PR machine wrapped in a lab coat. Eventually, Alexander Graham Bell had to step in to save the magazine from Edison's deficits. I tell you this because it sets the stage. From its inception, the truth of science has been vulnerable to human ego, financial desperation, and the need for a perfect narrative. To understand the greatest scientific fraud of the 21st century, we need to zoom all the way in, to the boundary of life, the cell membrane. Every cell is wrapped in a wall made of phospholipids. The first one, lecithin, was identified in 1847 in chicken egg yolks. These molecules are amphiphilic. They have water-loving heads and water-repelling tails. In your body, they align tail to tail to form a bilayer. This bilayer is the gatekeeper. They let nutrients in and keep toxins out. In your brain, these phospholipids are essential for neuronal structure. By the time you're 80, your levels drop by 20%. But scientists want to play God with these membranes. In the 1960s, Thomas Chang created the first artificial cells. Today, we use them for targeted drug delivery. At UC Berkeley, they are even creating cyborg bacteria, coated in nanoparticles to harvest sunlight. Biology is messy, but scientists are obsessed with controlling it. They want to isolate specific proteins, put them in a synthetic box, and prove how the machine works. And nowhere was this desperation more intense than in the fight against Alzheimer's. It's a quiet morning in November 1901. Frankfurt, Germany. Inside the asylum for the insane and epileptics, a clinical psychiatrist, Dr. Alois Alzheimer, sits across from 51-year-old August Deter. She's lost. Not in the city, but in her own mind. She can't remember her husband's name or her own age. She tells the doctor, "I have lost myself, so to speak." When August dies 5 years later, Dr. Alzheimer does something that changes history. He takes a slice of her brain, thin as a whisper, applies a silver staining technique, and looks through the lens. he sees the face of the enemy. He sees them. Dense, ugly clumps of protein and tangled fibers, what we now call plucks and tangles. For 80 years, these were just curiosities. Until 1984, when researchers George Glenner and Kane Wong officially identified amyloid beta, A-beta, as the main component of those plaques. Then came 1991, the Big Bang. Researchers traced family-linked Alzheimer's to mutations in the gene responsible for the precursor protein of amyloid. This discovery birthed the amyloid hypothesis. The logic was as simple and seductive as a falling domino. Your brain fails to clear amyloid beta protein. It clumps into plaques. It triggers inflammation. It kills cells. Dementia. It was elegant. It was seductive. And it was about to become a billion-dollar dogma. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the amyloid mafia wasn't just a nickname. It was a description of the field's absolute power structure. This was an ecosystem that fiercely protected a scientific monoculture, guarded by a network of high-level researchers, journal editors, and federal gatekeepers. At the center of this fortress sat the high priest, Dr. Eliezer Maslaya. As the director of the Division of Neuroscience at the National Institute on Aging, he controlled a staggering $2.6 billion annual budget. Maslaya dictated which theories lived and which ones died. Researchers knew the golden rule. If your proposal didn't bow to the amyloid hypothesis, you didn't get his blessing or the federal funding. This created a decade of amyloid tunnel vision. Roughly $1.6 billion a year, half the NIH's Alzheimer's budget, was funneled exclusively into amyloid projects. Promising alternatives were starved. Did you think Alzheimer's might be caused by neuroinflammation? Too bad. No funding. What about the viral theory? The idea that common viruses like herpes simplex 1 trigger the amyloid response as an immune defense. Laughed out of the room. How about the metabolic theory, which framed Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes, driven by insulin resistance in the brain? The amyloid mafia wasn't interested. UCSF researcher John Forsyth famously noted that because of this group's dominance, the amyloid hypothesis became the scientific equivalent of the Ptolemaic model of the solar system, in which the sun and planets rotate around Earth. Questioning it was a career-ending move. But the Baptists, the true believers, were facing an existential crisis. The data wasn't behaving. Between 1995 and 2025, the pursuit of this theory would see a 98% failure rate in drug development. Major pharma giants developed drugs that cleared plaques perfectly, but patients continued to decline. They needed a miracle. They needed a specific, soluble, memory-killing toxin, a toxic star, to explain why invisible oligomers were the real killers, not the visible plaques. In 2002, the University of Minnesota became the epicenter of the search. Dr. Karen Ash, a highly distinguished neuroscientist, was running the show. Ash was a titan. She had previously worked with Nobel laureate Stanley Prusiner and had created the TG2576 transgenic mouse. This genetically engineered mouse was the golden goose of the industry. If your drug didn't work on Ash's mice, it didn't go to human trials. But Ash needed someone with a golden touch to find the invisible poison in her mice. She found him, Sylvain Lesné. Lesné was hired straight out of a PhD program at the University of Caen, Normandy, in 2002. He was known as passionate, hard-working, and charismatic, and most importantly, a master of the Western blot. These blots separate proteins by size, appearing as stacked dark bands on film, the ultimate proof of a protein's existence. While other researchers' blots were messy, Lesnay's were art. They were clean. They were sharp.
But here's the gossip you won't find in textbooks. Back in France, Lesnay's doctoral advisor, cell biologist Dr. Denis Vivien, had already seen red flags. During a paper revision for Nature Neuroscience, Vivien noticed Lesnay's images looked too perfect. Vivien asked other students in the Cannes laboratory to replicate Lesnay's findings. They all failed. Vivien confronted Lesnay. Now, Vivien didn't have irrefutable proof of digital manipulation at the time, but he knew something was deeply wrong. In a move that is almost unheard of in the publish or perish world of academia, Vivien withdrew the paper entirely prior to publication to preserve his own scientific integrity. He subsequently broke off all scientific and personal contact with Lesnay. But in the high-velocity world of American research, warnings don't always cross the ocean. Lesnay took total control of preparing images in the Ash lab. On March 16, 2006, the world stood still. Lesnay and Ash published a landmark paper in Nature. They claimed to have isolated a previously unknown amyloid beta species, A beta star 56. The data was explosive. Lesnay reported that when he injected purified A beta star 56 protein from genetically engineered mice into young, healthy rats, they suddenly couldn't recall simple, previously learned information, like navigating a maze. This was the smoking gun. It was the first substance in brain tissue shown to definitively cause memory impairment. An editorial in Nature literally labeled a beta star 56 a star suspect, and the global Alzheimer's community threw a parade. Ash won the Potemkin Prize, the Nobel of Alzheimer's research. Lesnay was hailed as a prodigy. By 2009, he secured his own NIH-funded laboratory at the University of Minnesota, raked in millions of dollars in federal grants through 2012. In 2016, Lesnay was promoted to associate professor with tenure at UMN. In addition to receive over $7 million grants for Alzheimer's research through 2022. The influence of this single paper was staggering. It became one of the most cited papers in the history of Alzheimer's basic research, accumulating roughly 2,300 citations. It single-handedly redirected the global trajectory of drug development. Because of this one paper, annual NIH support for studies labeled amyloid, oligomer, and Alzheimer's skyrocketed from near zero to $287 million by the year 2021. The amyloid mafia had their miracle. The dogma was secure. But while the headline screamed breakthrough, a terrifying question haunted the elite labs of Harvard, Cambridge, and Stanford. Why can't anyone else find the star? Top researchers, including Harvard's Dennis Selkoe, one of the most prominent advocates for the amyloid hypothesis, spent thousands of hours trying to replicate Lesnay's work. They followed his protocols to the letter. They used the same antibodies, the same mice, but they found nothing. Selkoe eventually gave up in 2008, publicly stating he couldn't find A beta star 56. The gossip in faculty lounges was getting loud. Why could Sylvain Lenné see the invisible while the rest of the world was blind? Independent experts were skeptical of his methods, claiming they made no biochemical sense. So why didn't the field rise up and call fraud? Because of the toxic culture of academia. Scientific journals are completely uninterested in publishing negative results or failed replications. and junior researchers are absolutely terrified to publicly contradict famous, award-winning investigators who control the grant money. The doubts remained confined to hushed faculty lounge gossip. Meanwhile, the amyloid mafia weaponized Lesnay's fake data. Whenever a rival researcher proposed an alternative grant, the reviewers would use Lesnay's perfect results as an institutional shield, essentially saying, "Why bother funding this? Lesnay and Ash already proved the 56-star protein causes the disease. Next." For 16 years, the fortress of the amyloid hypothesis seemed impenetrable, shielded by billions of dollars and decades of academic prestige. Patients endured invasive spinal taps and experimental drugs that caused severe brain swelling and microhemorrhaging, a condition known as ARIA, all in the desperate hope of a cure that was conceptually anchored to a fabricated protein. But the cracks were forming on the fringes of the internet. As early as 2013, anonymous digital sleuths on a post-publication peer review forum called PubPeer began flagging anomalies. They pointed out suspicious duplicated bands and cloned pixels in Lesnay's work. But for nearly a decade, the scientific establishment, the journals, and the universities completely ignored these warnings. It would take a massive, completely separate pharmaceutical scandal and a lone neuroscientist with a sharp eye for pixels to finally bring the 16-year deception to light. To understand how the walls finally came down, we have to travel 700 miles away to a quiet home office in Tennessee. Meet Dr. Matthew Schrag. By day, he's a vascular neurologist at Vanderbilt. By night, he's a data sleuth with a gift for seeing patterns in pixels that most people miss. It's August 2021. Schrag was hired by two neuroscientists, Dr. David Brett and Dr. Jeffrey Pitt. They are Wall Street short sellers. They wanted him to investigate Cassava Sciences and their drug, Simufilam. Cassava claimed their drug improved cognition by repairing a misfolded scaffolding protein called filamin A, which they alleged blocked the toxic accumulation of amyloid beta. Wall Street ate it up, pushing the company's valuation to staggering heights. But Schrag had massive ethical concerns. He feared that the 1,800 desperate patients volunteering for Cassava's Phase 3 clinical trials were being exposed to potential side effects with absolutely zero chance of medical benefit. Schrag dug into the archives of Dr. Huao-Yan Wang of the City University of New York, the scientific architect behind Cassava's drug. He found what he called a patchwork quilt of digital manipulation, swapped, mirrored, and duplicated protein bands across dozens of papers. While deep-seated in the Cassava investigation, Schrag wanted to test his skills on other papers. In December 2021, he did a general search on PubPeer for Alzheimer's. He stumbled upon a trail of breadcrumbs, anonymous flags by sleuths like Cheshire, and the renowned forensic image consultant Elizabeth Bick. They were pointing out highly suspicious duplicated bands in Western blots. Schrag noticed that 3 of these flagged papers listed a researcher he had never heard of as the first or senior author, Sylvain Lesnay. Curious, Schrag applied his specialized software tools to Lesnay's papers. Staring at his screen, Schrag recognized the exact same digital fingerprints of manipulation he had just uncovered in the Cassava investigation. Wondering if the foundational pillars of the entire amyloid hypothesis might be compromised, Schrag initiated a lateral search into the most highly cited papers in the field. This search led him straight to Lesnay and Ash's landmark 2006 Nature paper, the paper that birthed the toxic star. Authentic Western blots are biological films. They naturally feature random noise, grain, and microscopic imperfections. But in Lesnay's Nature paper, this natural messiness had been completely replaced by mathematical impossibilities.
Schrag exposed the fraud by identifying three primary tools of digital forgery. First, the cloning tool. Schrag found protein bands with a 0.98 correlation, a near-perfect match, proving they were digitally copy-pasted to artificially boost the appearance of A beta star 56. Second, splicing. By cranking up the brightness, Schrag revealed vertical seams and ghostly white halos. It was a Frankenstein image, different experiments digitally glued together. And third, the eraser tool. He found white voids, suspiciously clean spots where unwanted protein results had been neatly wiped away to fit the narrative. Matthew Schrag wasn't just looking at a mistake. He realized that for 16 years, the North Star of Alzheimer's research was a Photoshop job. In January 2022, Schrag submitted a massive whistleblower dossier to the NIH. He realized the North Star of Alzheimer's was a Photoshop job. But the NIH didn't act. In May 2022, while the investigation was secret, the NIH actually gave Lesney a new R01 grant. That's when Schrag reached out to investigative journalist Charles Piller at Science magazine. Piller launched a 6-month investigation, corroborating the fraud with world-class image analysts like Elizabeth Bick and Jana Christopher. On July 21, 2022, Piller dropped the bombshell. Blots on a field? The article acted as an earthquake. It shattered the illusion, exposing the golden child of Minnesota as a man who had built an empire on a foundation of digital dust. But as the news broke, the gates of the University of Minnesota didn't open. They locked. The institutions were not ready to admit that their star was a fake. For an institution like UMN, a global titan of research, the allegations against Sylvain Lesney weren't just a PR nightmare. They were an existential threat. That 2006 Nature paper was the golden ticket that kept federal funding flowing like a river. Inside the academic health center, the hallways were buzzing with pure anxiety. Lesney's mentor, Dr. Karen Ash, had personally brought in over $28 million in NIH grants. To admit her lab was a factory for doctored images was to invite the federal government to perform an autopsy on the entire department. We're talking about grant clawbacks, the university having to pay back millions. So, how do you defend the indefensible? In 2023, UMN tried a move called a masterclass in the whitewash. After an internal investigation, they claimed to clear Lesney of misconduct for the 2006 paper. Their logic? They basically said, sure, the images were manipulated, but we don't see any proof of intent to deceive. The response was immediate and brutal. Elizabeth Bick pointed out that using a digital eraser tool to wipe away protein bands isn't a clerical error. It is deliberate forgery. This was actually not the first time the university had to deal with a massive, high-profile biomedical fraud scandal. Oh no. Years prior, they harbored a researcher named Catherine Verfaele, who had published a blockbuster 2002 paper in Nature claiming that adult bone marrow contained pluripotent stem cells. That discovery was supposed to revolutionize regenerative medicine, but it turned out her paper was also fraudulent. Yet, Verfaele's paper was never retracted, and she simply moved back to her home country of Belgium to become a highly funded star of a stem cell institute at KU Leuven, where she was recently cleared of misconduct in a move that baffled independent sleuths. So, Minnesota had a track record of protecting zombie scientists who brought in massive grants. And for over 2 years following the initial revelations by Schrag, Lesney remained a tenured associate professor, safely hidden behind the university's bureaucratic walls, continuing to draw his salary and maintain a laboratory.
While Minnesota was circling the wagons, the earthquake hit the very top of the mountain. It was time to look at the high priest himself, Dr. Eliezer Maslier. In September 2024, Science magazine dropped a new investigation titled A Field on Edge. It revealed that Maslier, the man who controlled a $2.6 billion annual budget, was under investigation for systemic image manipulation, spanning over 130 published papers and nearly 30 years of work. Maslier wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was one of the most cited neuroscientists in history. By allegedly faking his own data, he had built a fortress. He used his manipulated results to prove that amyloid was the only path, and then used his power at the NIH to funnel billions of taxpayer dollars into that narrow tunnel. He didn't just guard the gate. He made sure the gate only opened for people who told the same story he did. Data sleuths Matthew Schrag, Elizabeth Bick, and Jana Christopher uncovered recycled images throughout Maslier's career. In one case, a Western blot showed background noise that was perfectly identical across 5 different experiments. The odds of that happening naturally? 1 in a trillion. He was the teacher, the student, and the judge, giving himself an A+ every single time. How does the most powerful man in neuroscience fall without making a sound? It's called institutional damage control. The NIH knew about these allegations as early as 2023, but didn't alert the press. Maslier was quietly moved out of his executive role the year after. No public firing. The rumor among DC insiders: the NIH was terrified that if the public realized the godfather of the field was a fraud, the entire neuroscience budget would be on the chopping block. We follow the threads as they tie into a single, devastating knot. Maslier and Lesnay had created a symbiotic relationship of fabrication. For Lesnay's toxic star to look plausible, the field needed a high priest saying amyloid was the absolute driver. Maslier's faked foundation protected Lesnay's specific star, which in turn provided the fresh data needed to keep the money flowing. We talk about the billions lost, the wasted years, and the failed theories. But we haven't talked about the cost paid in flesh and blood. Because these trials didn't just fail to help. In many cases, they caused active, physical harm. Between 2003 and 2021, the pharmaceutical industry maintained a staggering 98% failure rate in Alzheimer's drug development. While Sylvain Lesnay was tinkering with pixels, the world's largest corporations were betting their futures on his toxic star. Cumulative private expenditures on Alzheimer's R&D reached approximately $42.5 billion. Every billion spent chasing the amyloid ghost was a billion not spent investigating neuroinflammation, viral triggers, or metabolic dysfunction. The clinical trial graveyard is littered with the corpses of drugs like bapineuzumab and solanezumab, drugs that did exactly what the theory asked. They cleared the plaques perfectly, but they failed to clear the fog of dementia. There is a term that strikes fear into the hearts of researchers: ARIA. It stands for amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. In plain English, it's a crisis of the brain. The irony is cruel. These drugs were so aggressive at stripping amyloid from blood vessels that they left them brittle and leaking. In trials for the drug Aduhelm, nearly half of participants experienced some form of ARIA, severe brain swelling and microhemorrhaging that resulted in blinding headaches, seizures, and in some cases, death. Since 1995, over 184,000 volunteers have signed up for these trials. They are the unsung heroes, people like Larry and Rita. Larry was vibrant. The early signs of Alzheimer's began to flicker like a failing light bulb. For his wife Rita, a clinical trial wasn't just medicine, it was a call to arms. Larry endured thousands of hours of tests, countless blood draws, and then the spinal taps. These are lumbar punctures, invasive, painful, carrying the risk of suicide headaches that last for days. But Larry took them because science told him the amyloid was suffocating his brain.
Trial nurses whispered about an unspoken conspiracy of hope. Patients were so terrified of losing their only lifeline that they would hide their symptoms. They would lie about the headaches or the confusion just to stay in a game that was rigged from the start.
Look at the Aduhelm saga, a documentary-level example of what happens when politics and profit override reality. In 2019, Biogen pulled the plug after a futility analysis showed it would fail. Their stock plummeted, losing $18 billion in one afternoon. But months later, they resurrected the drug, claiming that if you looked at the data just right, it actually worked. Internal documents later revealed that FDA officials had actually coached Biogen on how to present their data. An independent advisory committee voted 10-0 against approval, and yet, the FDA approved it anyway in 2021. 3 committee members resigned in protest. By 2024, Biogen essentially gave up and handed the rights back. When the news of the fraud broke, Lesne, Wang, and Maslia, the betrayal didn't just sting, it burned. These families had put their bodies on the line for a toxic star that was nothing more than a Photoshop brush. To the 184,000 heroes who walked into the dark, we haven't forgotten you. The map is finally being redrawn. The scientists pack up their labs, a different kind of storm is rolling in. Because in the real world, when you lose billions based on a lie, someone eventually comes to collect the debt. Welcome to the legal and financial reckoning. As the dust settled on the University of Minnesota campus in 2025, academic anxiety turned into something much more ominous: financial accounting. For 20 years, the global community assumed the Lesne lab data was ironclad. When that shattered, it broke budgets. The federal government, under pressure from a furious Congress, has stopped looking at these as scientific failures. They are looking at them as financial crimes. The weapon of choice? The False Claims Act. If you take federal money based on fraudulent data, you aren't just a bad scientist, you are defrauding the American taxpayer.
In late 2024 and throughout 2025, the Department of Justice began demanding clawbacks, demanding that UMN return tens of millions in NIH grant money. The university tried to claim the manipulations were cosmetic, but when the DOJ saw systemic fraud across 20 papers, that defense folded like a house of cards. But if you think the government has an easy path, you haven't seen the documentary-level plot twist of Dr. Huaoyan Wang. In June 2024, a federal grand jury indicted the CUNY professor for allegedly defrauding the NIH of $16 million. It was supposed to be the landmark case to put scientists on notice. But in October 2025, the trial hit a wall. The DOJ was forced to dismiss every single charge with prejudice. The reason? A massive Brady violation. The prosecution got caught failing to disclose a secret internal report that found no scientific misconduct or stated it couldn't be proven. The judge was so incensed, he apologized to Wang on behalf of the entire justice system. Wang walked away a free man, but a scientific pariah.
While the scientists battle in court, the corporate world is facing a demolition. The Minnesota Mirage planted explosives under the entire pharmaceutical industry.
In the world of big pharma, patents are billion-dollar walls. But a 2025 forensic audit pulled the rug out. The audit revealed 238 active patents for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's drugs that cite the disgraced work of Eliezer Maslia. This created a patent minefield. If your intellectual property is built on faked data, that patent is vulnerable. Rival companies are already sharpening their knives, preparing reviews to invalidate these patents. Meanwhile, on Wall Street, the Securities and Exchange Commission has filed charges against biotech executives for misleading investors about the success of their amyloid programs. A class action cottage industry has emerged. Investors aren't just suing the companies, they're suing the universities for a conspiracy of silence. Subpoenaed emails show administrators were warned about the fraud years before they acted. They knew the star was toxic. They just didn't want to turn off the lights. The wreckage forced the government to act. Enter the oversight revolution. The NIH established a brand new Research Integrity Office with a $200 million budget. Their job? Random spot checks and forensic audits on raw data of every major grant recipient. A new federal law now requires that raw, unedited Western blots be uploaded to a public repository at the moment of publication. The era of the digital darkroom is being closed by the heavy hand of the law. As we stand here in early 2026, the shockwaves from the toxic star and the Maslia scandals have finally begun to settle into a new, albeit scarred, landscape. The amyloid mafia has been dismantled, laboratories have been audited, and the field of neuroscience is attempting to rebuild its shattered reputation. But what became of the people who stood at the center of this storm? Before we look at the future, we have to look at the wreckage left behind. First, the man who started it all, Sylvain Lesné. The golden child is officially gone. He resigned from his tenured position at the University of Minnesota on March 1st, 2025. After the university flagged data integrity concerns in 4 more of his papers beyond that original 2006 Nature study, his career in legitimate science was dead on arrival. Today, he lives quietly in the Twin City suburbs, avoided by the press and carrying a radioactive name no lab will touch. But there is one final, defiant detail. Lesné remains the only author who refused to sign the original retraction of the A-beta star 56 paper. He is holding on to the star until the very end. Then there is Dr. Karen Ash. Despite the wreckage, she remains an endowed professor at UMN, but the Ash empire has taken a permanent blow. She spent 2025 in a defensive crouch, publishing clarification papers and trying to prove A-beta star 56 is still valid, even if the images that introduced it were manufactured. While she speaks of devastation over being misled, the field is still asking the uncomfortable question: how does a titan miss 2 decades of forgery happening right under her nose? And the high priest, Dr. Eliezer Maslia. He was cast out in late 2024, and the collapse of his legacy has been breathtaking. By the end of 2025, he reached a staggering 18 retractions, with over 800 papers still under the forensic microscope. He has become the ultimate case study of institutional failure, cited in every ethics textbook in the country. Then there is the man who beat the Department of Justine, Dr. Huoyan Wang. While he walked away a free man in October 2025 due to a Brady violation, the scientific world hasn't been so forgiving. CUNY retracted several of his papers for unreliable data. He is retired now,
a free man but a scientific pariah.
And cassava sciences? On January 13th, 2026, the dream died. Their Phase 3 trials for simufilam were a total failure, missing every clinical endpoint. In a classic biotech pivot, they've abandoned Alzheimer's to pursue epilepsy with their remaining safety data. But if this story has a hero, it is the last man standing, Dr. Matthew Schrag. He is still at Vanderbilt, still treating patients, and still hunting ghosts. He has become a global voice for scientific integrity, warning that science currently has no mechanism to catch a sophisticated patient liar. Beside him is Charles Piller, whose 2026 book, Doctored, is already a bestseller, and who is currently turning his scalpel toward AI-generated fraud in cancer research. But the most incredible part of 2026 isn't the fall of the icons, it's the great diversification. For 30 years, we lived in a monoculture. Now, the monopoly is dead. The 2025 NIH Progress Report confirmed that nearly 80% of new drugs in development target something other than amyloid. The tau and vascular theory. We've discovered that harmful tau hijacks the energy of blood vessels, weakening the blood-brain barrier. We are now building vascular patches to stop the flood of toxins. The metabolic theory. Some call it type 3 diabetes. We are watching Phase 3 trials for semaglutide, Ozempic for the brain, to see if fixing energy metabolism can stop the decline. The microglia revolution. Using CRISPR, we've found that the brain's janitors are actually sentinels. When they fail, they trigger friendly fire incidents that kill neurons. The gut-brain axis. We are even exploring fecal transplants to reset inflammatory signals traveling up the vagus nerve. A new generation of open science investigators, like Catherine Prater and Marios Georgiadis, are using transcriptomics and lipidomics to map the brain in high definition. They are building brain-on-a-chip models, living human circuits that reflect our real biology, not a rodent's. We can never recover the $42 billion lost in the amyloid graveyard. We can't give Larry and Rita their time back. We can't undo the brain hemorrhages and the dashed hopes of 184,000 volunteers. The collapse of the Minnesota Mirage has forced science to become more transparent, more rigorous, and finally, more honest. The star of A Beta Star 56 has burnt out, but in its place, 1,000 new lights have been turned on. Because in the end, science isn't about the perfect blot or the prestigious grant. It's about the truth. And the truth, however painful, is the only thing that will ever set us free. This concludes our investigation into The Toxic Star, our first episode from the Artifact podcast. I'm Daniel Walls. Keep your eyes on the data, but never ignore the noise. Thank you for listening.